Hello and welcome to Objective-C Programming. This is lecture number 10 and we are 75% done. So, this lecture would be about two things, about user defaults and notification center. But the main thing is what user defaults is. And you probably know, if you used a computer for more than a day, there are some settings and there are default settings that come with the program. There are settings that come with the operating system, and there are some settings the user might be able to change and make them default for this user or maybe for the system. So this is how it works in OS X. Every application saves its default settings into a specific folder, and that folder is in user folder, library, and preferences. So if you if you go to that, here I have a terminal, and this is my home directory, and if I go to library preferences, I will see a huge list of different files. So each file is corresponding to one or multiple programs, and each file consists some settings for that program. So this is how it does. Okay. So let me go back here. Every application comes with some factory settings, something that is set up by the developer, and these are the default settings. They don't write these default settings into a user directory because there are user settings, and user settings define the difference between the factory settings and something a user wants. So only the difference from factory settings are saved into that directory I just showed you. So, of course, this is a common feature, and most of the applications have some settings, and we want to be able to give user the ability to change them. So there is a class that comes with the framework, and it's called NSUser Defaults, and this is the class we're going to use today. Before we go into that class, we have to recall dictionaries. And I hope you remember, this is a really simple data structure. A dictionary is a collection of key and value pairs. So you have a key, which is a string, and a value, which is usually a pointer to some object. And you can store any number of objects. The only thing that needs to be unique is the key. Like in the array, the index should be unique. In the dictionary, there's no order, so there's no index, but there is a key, and the key should be unique because this is how you're going to get the object. And you can get the object using the method called object for key and pass it an NS string, which would be the key. If this key doesn't exist, then this method will return nil, and you can check if nil, then say this key doesn't exist and handle this situation somehow. Just like with many other NS data structures, there's a NS dictionary and NS mutable dictionary. And the difference is, as usual, the NS dictionary is something you can set up, but you cannot change later. You can still get the objects by keys, but you cannot add or delete keys. And if you want to do it, you need to create an NS mutable dictionary, which is a subclass of NS dictionary. Okay. So if you take a look under the hood, then you're going to see that NS Dictionary is implemented using a hash table. And we're not going to talk about hash tables, but if you are familiar with data structures, then hash table is familiar for you. A hash table is the idea of storing something like a dictionary, but converting keys into some sort of a number using some function. And this makes it much easier to get to the objects you want to get to. So instead of using the actual key that you type in, so my key would be a string, like a name of something, the NS Dictionary actually converts it into some function, into some number using a hash function. And every time I want to access it, it converts it, the key I'm asking for, and uses that hash number. So this makes NS Dictionary quite fast, and this is good for us because we want to use NS Dictionaries a lot. So these are some methods in this class. These are instance methods, so you're going to call those methods on objects of NS Dictionary instances of it. So the first one is called all keys, returns an NS array of all the keys in the dictionary. The count method returns an unsigned integer, which is the number of pairs, the key value pairs in this dictionary. And you can get, as I said before, some object by a key if you pass it a key as NS string. You can also loop through the whole dictionary using the construction like this. So for every key in some dictionary, this is of course an NS dictionary or an NS mutable dictionary. You can get to every object. So you just go through all the keys in this dictionary. So this is quite good, and most of the time this is more than enough for you. There are some methods in NS mutable dictionary. First one is the class method. You can see the plus here. Not often we see it, but sometimes we do, and we're going to see more class methods in this lecture. So this is called dictionary, and it's quite obvious. It creates an empty dictionary. Then you can remove some object using a key, and just like with adding, you give it a key and it removes the object using this key. Then you can set an object for a key, and this just adds another entry to the dictionary. So this is an NS mutable dictionary, don't forget that. This is why we have remove and set methods. All right, so we now have this dictionary and we can use it to store some values. And this is really useful for us because, well, those settings, they look like objects, they look like entries in that dictionary because we have some setting which could be represented by a name, and then we have a value. So something like the color of the window would be, let's say, yellow. So the key would be color of the window, and the value would be yellow, or the value would be actually the object of some color class that will represent yellow color. So we're going to use NS Dictionary for that. And let's move on to NSUser Defaults. So there are some factory defaults that come with the app, as I said, and user settings is the difference from that factory settings. So before we use user defaults, or before we use any user settings, we need to kind of remember the factory settings. So we need to get the settings that come with the application. And this process is done when the application starts. It gets all the factory settings, and we call it registering defaults. After this process is done, we need to read user defaults. We need to read what actually differs from the default factory settings. And we call it reading and using the defaults, which is quite obvious. Then we want, in our application, we want to use that preferences panel that we wrote last time to set the defaults, to change the user default so that next time application loads, it loads with the user default settings. And we call it, of course, setting defaults, or we can call it writing defaults. It doesn't really matter. So this is how it works. You have your application and you create an instance of NSUser Defaults. And first thing you do on startup, you register the defaults that come with your application, and those at some point go to the operating system. Then you want to read the user defaults. So if there is some settings that were done, that were written in last time, then the NSUser defaults will try to get those from the user directory, from the library preferences directory. And at some point you want to change the user default, so you set new default values, and again you talk to the NSUser defaults, and that thing sets the settings in that file that corresponds to your application. That file is an XML file, so NSUser defaults takes care of converting your Objective-C stuff into XML and saving that stuff. And when you get that stuff back, again, you have no idea how it's done, and you don't touch XML at all. You get back something that you can work with, and this is back to Objective-C layer. So these are some methods. We might not use all of them today, but just to give you an idea, first one is a class method again, and that returns the shared defaults object. So within your application, you can use this class method to get your NSUser defaults. And anytime you want to get something from that NSUser defaults or write something, like get something from the user and write that into user settings file, you can use this, and you will use this standard user defaults. This is how you get your object. Then goes multiple instance methods. So this one registers the factory defaults for the application, and it's quite obvious. Again, it says register defaults, and you pass it a dictionary with all the values you want to save. So this will make the user default, the factory default settings to be saved. Then you might want to save something that user wants to save. And again, we are using NS Dictionary. This is why we use pairs like this. We use the key and the value. So we always say the key is a string, but the value could be different. It could be a number, it could be a Boolean, it could be some object. So these are 4 methods for changing and saving the user settings. Okay, these are the methods of reading the defaults. And if user didn't write anything for those keys, we are going to get something from the factory settings. So don't worry, you don't have to set everything for the user. You might not set a single thing, and you will still be able to read the defaults. It's just if there is no user settings, then the factory settings will be taken. And again, we just pass the key and get the corresponding value, which is a Boolean for the key if it's a Boolean, and we can get a float, and an integer, and an object. And the last one removes the user preferences. So if you want to do that, then the application will continue to use the factory settings. Okay, so I told you before that there are only 2 layers. There is a factory settings and there's a user settings. And anytime you set something on the user level, it overrides the factory settings. And this is true, but this is not whole truth. There are actually more layers, or we call them domains. There are actually 5 layers. So yes, we have the factory settings that come with the application, but then the system comes in, because between your application and something the user wrote, there is an operating system that takes its role. So there's a language set in the system, and some settings in your application are based on the language of the system. So sometimes you download an application, and if you have an, let's say, English language set for the system, then some values would be taken from the English language. Or if you have Russian, then if the developer took care of this, then there will be Russian, maybe dates or names, etc. Then there are some user global settings, again, that come with the operating system. And the administrator of the machine sets some user global settings for that machine. And they go after this layer. Then there is that application layer, something that user of this particular application set for himself. But there's also another layer that can override the application settings. It's arguments. So we don't really touch that, but if you can still run your application using a command line as if it was a console text-based application. And you can sometimes pass some arguments, just like we did. Oh, actually, we didn't do it, but we could do it in the first Hello World application, because we had a main function and we were starting it as a console application. We could pass some parameters to it. We can still do it now because we still have a main function which takes an array of arguments, and we can pass some parameters there. They will override the application domain, but we're not going to touch that. So for this course and for this lecture as particular, we're going to touch those 2 layers, the factory settings and the user settings. So in the next module, let's actually do it.